This hour, you've heard about Congress blowing billions on wasteful earmarks. But now, a Fox investigation that goes way beyond pork.
He said, "You're telling me I can't take care of my family?"
East, West, and in between. Democrats and Republicans. Spending your taxes on projects that help make them rich.
I have called him Hastert the Bastard.
Regular Americans think it's wrong.
No fingerprints there. He certainly didn't publicize it.
Can Congress really say it's A-OK?
I was completely floored when I heard that.
A Fox News investigation. Pork, earmarks for profit. Here's Chris Wallace.
Here on Capitol Hill, there's a lot of talk about earmarks. Those are items stuck in the federal budget by a congressman or a senator, directing the government to spend taxpayer money on a project, usually in that politician's home district or state. Earmarks have become notorious because they're often slipped into massive bills at the last minute with no debate. And they're rarely discovered until after the bill is signed into law. They cost us up to $60 billion a year. And when we find out about them, the media usually focuses on projects that are dumb or wasteful. For example, in Alaska, a $223 million bridge to nowhere, followed by an $84 million ferry to nowhere. In North Carolina, a $500,000 teapot museum. And in New York, Hillary Clinton's $1 million earmark for a so-called hippie museum to commemorate Woodstock, which John McCain has joked about on the campaign trail.
I wasn't there. I'm sure it was a cultural and pharmaceutical event. I was tied up at the time.
Lawmakers use earmarks to reward a political supporter or to fund a pet project back home. But over the next hour, Fox News exposes a much more troubling practice. Lawmakers who earmark taxpayer money for projects that line their own bank accounts. We start in Illinois, where Greg Jarrett met a group of local residents who were standing up to a former Speaker of the House.
I've got a wonderful community. I've got beautiful wooded land and good people.
For the last 170 years, Marvel Davis's family has worked this farm some 60 miles outside Chicago, Illinois. A landscape rife with natural beauty. It's been home to Marvel Davis for more than 80 years, and the source of her livelihood, too.
What I've seen, it's breathtakingly beautiful.
Well, it is a beautiful community.
You've got paradise here.
We really do.
But her paradise is set to get paved in a controversial land deal, financed with $207 million of your money, which was sponsored by one of the most powerful legislators in the United States, a man who has pocketed millions as a result of the deal.
I have thought that there's no possibility that this thing can happen.
Marvel Davis is not the only person shocked at the idea.
The people in this township voted 88% against the Prairie Parkway, and we still have a center point.
Jan Strasma has also lived in these parts his whole life. Have 2 layers of asphalt. He's one of a group of residents speaking out against the project called the Prairie Parkway, a 37-mile-long highway which would cut right through their farmland, connecting 2 interstates. People like Jan claim that using the money to widen existing roads, such as Route 47, is wiser. It's cheaper, would take less time, and have less of an impact than running blacktop over this farmland.
And it's not just the highway, but it's everything that comes along with it that destroys not only the ecosystem, not only the environment, but our way of life.
Now, anytime a new road is built in the United States, there will be people who will complain, mostly because they don't want the changes to their community that a road often brings. But of course, if we bowed to all their concerns, nothing would ever get built, which is why the government is allowed to take a person's property for just compensation under certain circumstances. But while there's been some support of the Prairie Parkway, opposition seems to go way beyond the not-in-my-backyard crowd. Environmentalists are against it,
Illinois Governor Rod Blagojevich has spoken out in favor of widening existing roads. And Marvel claims that even the Illinois Department of Transportation, IDOT, is less than enthusiastic.
An IDOT man said this roadway is not high on our agenda.
There was no funding for it. It wasn't part of the state's budget. And a huge appropriations bill emerges from the conference committee with a $207 million earmark for the Prairie Parkway.
Bill Allison is a senior fellow with the Sunlight Foundation, a private watchdog group in Washington.
Most members had no idea it was there, slipped in at the last minute by Dennis Hastert.
That's right, Dennis Hastert, who was Speaker of the House when the bill was passed.
And he went to great lengths to make sure this controversial roadway was funded with those tax dollars. Why?
One of the key projects that he's been talking to me about for quite a while is what they call the Prairie Parkway.
Perhaps more troubling, how the extent of his financial interests in the area remained hidden until Marvel Davis came along.
Welcome back. I'm Chris Wallace. Our story resumes with a controversial highway in Illinois that was to run through the farms and homes of lifelong residents. And those folks were even more outraged when they realized who was behind it and why. Once again, here's Greg Jarrett.
On August 10, 2005, President George W. Bush came to Montgomery, Illinois to sign into law the Transportation Equity Act. The legislation held more than 6,000 earmarks, one of which was $207 million to build a 37-mile stretch of highway called the Prairie Parkway. Colleagues later remarked that then Speaker of the House Dennis Hastert had put more effort into getting this bill signed than any other in their memory. And convincing the president to come to his district to sign it was a big coup for Hastert. But a lot of people around these parts were not impressed. People who saw no use for the highway, people who thought it would hurt the environment, people who would have their land paved over, and people who suspected that Hastert might be doing more than bringing federal taxpayer dollars home to the district. People like 81-year-old Marvel Davis, whose family has lived the past 170 years on this farm, and which the townfolks also use as a social center. Hastert's Prairie Parkway would split the land in two.
It's the Prairie Parkway.
Marvel believed that by finding those who stood to profit from land along the parkway's proposed route, they might be able to learn why the road was suddenly funded.
She looked up all kinds of real estate records, really became a kind of citizen journalist story, David taking on Goliath.
Bill Allison is senior fellow of the Washington, D.C.-based Sunlight Foundation, a government corruption watchdog group.
She was one of the ones who originally identified that Little Rock Trust, and she's the one who found the paperwork on the trust itself.
The Little Rock Trust was listed in the real estate records as the owner of a large tract of land less than 2 miles from the proposed parkway.
Marvel assumed that land increased in value big time once the parkway was funded.
But who owned the trust? Marvel couldn't figure that out because under Illinois law, trusts have no obligation to make that information public. Enter Bill Allison. It turns out that back in Washington, he had been reviewing congressional financial disclosure records and discovered something in Dennis Hastert's he found suspicious. Hastert's report showed he was worth a maximum of $205,000 when he entered Congress in 1986. By 2005, he was worth a minimum of $3 million and possibly as much as $16 million, according to his latest form, which is reported in broad ranges.
I have decided not to seek another term of Congress.
This, by the way, was Hastert's last disclosure form.
Goodbye, friends.
He resigned from Congress in November of 2007. Allison thought the numbers just didn't add up.
Hastert is somebody who came into Congress with a very modest means, and again, he's been a school teacher, a state lawmaker. You don't get rich doing either of those jobs. And this is somebody who's now worth more than 7 figures.
whether Allison's suspicions were well-founded, he grew more curious, he says, after he called Hastert's office about those reports and felt he got the runaround. Combined with the whole business of the Prairie Parkway earmark, he felt something was amiss. So he hopped on a plane and flew out to Illinois. There, he discovered that Marvel and her group, formed to oppose the Parkway, had done much of his work for him. A skilled investigator, Allison knew how to find out who was behind the Little Rock Trust. He went to the tax records, and he turned up this receipt. It showed taxes on the trust had been paid by Mrs. Dennis Hastert.
When I found Gene Hastert was paying property taxes for the Little Rock Trust, and that was the proof that I felt like I needed.
Proof he needed that Hastert had, with partners, quietly bought up land near the Parkway he funded with a $207 million earmark.
Dennis Hastert's name wasn't on it, and no fingerprints there.
Local resident Jan Strasma.
You can name the trust the Hastert Trust, and gee, we'd know. But if you call it something else, it could be anybody.
With the trust now exposed, Allison dug deeper into the real estate records and found that Hastert had come to profit big time from the Prairie Parkway earmark. In February 2004, Hastert and his partners, which included Dallas Ingmanson, a major state Republican leader who is described as Hastert's political mentor, purchased 69 acres adjoining Hastert's property. The cost? $340,000. Then, in May 2005, 2 months before the Prairie Parkway earmark passed Congress, Hastert carved 69 acres from his farm and conveyed it to the Little Rock Trust. In short, that meant the trust owned a 138-acre tract less than 2 miles from the proposed highway. As we mentioned, it was August 2005 when President Bush signed the bill which committed the federal government to spending $207 million to build the Prairie Parkway. 4 months later, the Little Rock Trust sold the land to a developer for $5 million. We wanted to speak with Dennis Hastert and ask him about the Little Rock Trust and the ethics of these earmarks, but our repeated requests for an interview were not granted. Days before we went to air, Hastert's attorney J. Randy Evans did send us this email, quote, "Any suggestion that there was any connection between Speaker Hastert's long-standing support for the Prairie Parkway project and his purchase of property adjoining his home would be false and improper." Evans further argued that to suggest Speaker Hastert did anything wrong would mean that any member of Congress who invests in his own district could never help his district. Evans concluded by saying that Speaker Hastert can add nothing to these facts.
He held the land for less than a year and made a $2 million profit on it, and because it was right near the Parkway. I mean, there's a classic example of I seen my chances and I took them.
I have called him Hastert the Bastard.
Really? Why?
Because he, I think, has really betrayed a whole bunch of people, you know.
At 81 years old, all Marvel Davis wants is to spend the rest of her days on the land her family has farmed for the better part of 2 centuries. She should get her wish. The planned road runs by her house, but not through it. Could she turn a profit on her land just like the former Speaker of the House? She doesn't know and doesn't care. In fact, in 2006, she donated 116 acres of it to a forest preserve. The rest she's willed to the town, so her farm will hopefully still be a place the community can gather after she's gone.
It all goes to charity when I leave this world. But that's the way I want it to be.
Coming up.
He said, "You're telling me I can't take care of my family?"
Did this congressman earmark your tax dollars to benefit his family? After the break. Welcome back. Our investigation takes us next to Pennsylvania with an earmark scandal that began more than 10 years ago.
Joe Udicek, like most of the men in the fading coal towns of northeastern Pennsylvania, works with his hands and is proud of it.
We're a coal mining industry. We're trying to pull ourselves up by the bootstraps.
74-year-old Udicek has lived here all his life. For more than 40 years, he's worked in construction, operating heavy equipment and managing development sites. In the late 1970s, Joe met Paul Kanjorski, who was a local attorney, and they became instant friends. He later supported Kanjorski, a Democrat who first ran for Congress in 1982, unsuccessfully.
Paul Kanjorski was, I thought, a personal friend. I thought I was a part of the family. And I thought his ideas were great.
That's why in 1984, when Kanjorski ran a second time, Udicek and his wife again worked on his campaign. After Kanjorski won, he personally thanked them in this note, quote, "No letter or writing can possibly express my appreciation for your limitless help and loyalty." And Kanjorski eventually rewarded Udicek with more than words of thanks. In 1996, he recommended Udicek for a job running the Regional Equipment Center, a nonprofit company which took surplus government construction equipment, repaired it, and completed reclamation projects for the community, like these ballparks and soccer fields.
Who started that nonprofit?
That was a nonprofit started by Congressman Paul Kanjorski.
I've been listening.
Joe believes the idea behind the program was good and says by bringing it to his area, Congressman Kanjorski helped his constituents.
Did you think he was honest and ethical?
Absolutely. Thought that this guy was the best thing that ever happened to northeastern Pennsylvania.
But Joe's view of Kanjorski would change 2 years later, with $1.1 million worth of federal money that the congressman helped the Regional Equipment Center receive in 1998. That $1.1 million, taxpayer money, was funding for a program that would use water jet technology to pulverize materials like tires into fine particles for environmental cleanup. It could also be used to mine the area's coal supply. That sounded like a reasonable use of taxpayer money to Udicek.
But there was a hitch.
Absolutely.
What happened next would end his longtime friendship with Kanjorski. Udicek has never told his story on television before.
The money was put in our bank account. Then the congressman came to me and said, "Listen, you don't have enough expertise to do this project." And I agreed. I said, absolutely.
But the congressman had a solution.
He said, "Don't worry about it. I've got a company I want you to partner with. I'll send them in to see you." I said, "Fine." The next day, Peter Kanjorski came to my office with a contract.
The nephew of the congressman.
The nephew of the congressman. And he's telling me about a new company that's being formed. And I said to him, "Who owns this company?" He said, "Well, I own part of it, and we own part of it." I said, "Not me. You get out of this office," I said, "and take them papers, because the Regional Equipment Center is not going to perform anything like that."
Why?
Well, I thought just because they were family members of the congressman, it didn't look right.
How much did he want you to use for the companies connected to his family members?
All of it.
All of it?
All of it.
Every single penny?
Every single penny.
Taxpayer monies that would go right into the pockets of the congressman's family?
Absolutely.
Udicek convened the other directors of the Regional Equipment Center for an emergency board meeting, and in what may be a first, actually voted not to accept over $1 million from the U.S. government.
Udicek says Kanjorski was livid and angrily told the board they were making him look bad by not taking the money.
The congressman was adamant that we were going to do this.
Was he bullying you?
Well, you know, yeah, he thinks he could bully somebody, and he thought he could bully me. But we thought it was wrong, we thought it was immoral, and we just wouldn't do it.
Joe says it was then that Congressman Kanjorski followed him out of the meeting and stunned him by stating the true motivation.
He said, "You're telling me I can't take care of my family?" He said, "Well, I'm telling you it's going to be done, and it's going to be done with you or without you. And I'll just bury you, I'll destroy you, but this is going to be done.
That's right. Yudichak says the congressman threatened to bury him.
But Yudichak didn't back down. In fact, he took the unprecedented step of writing this letter, forcing the government to take back the money.
We just turned the money back to the federal government. Absolutely refused.
But the next time, Kanjorski would cut out the middleman and direct the money right to his family. And there would be a lot more than $1.1 million involved.
Coming up, the Kanjorskis get your money. And just wait till you hear what they did with it.
It was sort of like trying to collaborate with the cast of Looney Tunes.
After the break. Welcome back. I'm Chris Wallace. We now return to the story of Congressman Paul Kanjorski of northeastern Pennsylvania. Once a good friend, Joe Yudichak, says Kanjorski flat out told him he intended to use earmarks to take care of his own family. And that was just the beginning.
I tried to stop them in the beginning when with the initial $1.1 million. They wouldn't take my advice. Went on to get $9 million more, and I thought that was the worst thing that ever happened.
This is Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, devastated by flood and decades of economic hardship. An investment here of $10 million could have had a huge impact. But when its congressman wrangled that very amount right from the taxpayers, it didn't go to Main Street or redevelopment. Instead, it went to a company run by the congressman's family members. In 1998, Kanjorski's relatives incorporated a for-profit company called Cornerstone Technologies. For the next 4 years, it was funded by those millions in earmarks. 4 nephews and his daughter were either owners and or board members. None were available for comment. The company first rented space in this building. Who co-owned the property? Congressman Kanjorski, whose rent check went directly from taxpayer wallets to his own. It was touted as a company that might help turn around desperate coal towns and make them prosperous by finding new uses for anthracite coal. But instead of a company geared up to meet a scientific challenge run by men who knew how to turn ideas into products,
it was clear that these guys were clueless.
Harold Schobert, head of Penn State's respected Energy Institute and a leading expert on anthracite coal, still shakes his head when he recalls getting involved with the company.
It was sort of like trying to collaborate with the cast of Looney Tunes. They were just really bad. I mean, even things like, how do we order chemicals? Well, you know, for heaven's sake, guys. I began to believe intuitively that there was something very seriously wrong with the way that company was proceeding.
What was it that made you suspicious?
There were a number of things.
Like when Schobert's people went to inspect Cornerstone's facility and were turned away.
They said, no, you can't go in because when the mill is running, it's so noisy, it could be injurious to your hearing. Well, the person noticed that A, Cornerstone people were going in and out of the room not wearing hearing protection themselves, and B, when they opened the door, you couldn't hear anything. So there was obviously nothing running.
We asked Congressman Kanjorski to speak with us on camera. He declined, but he offered to answer our questions via email. We sent him a list of 22. Never got any answers. But shortly before this broadcast, he sent us a statement saying, "This is a political attack by the Republican machine and nothing more." He said the allegations are 6 years old and had already been dismissed as false.
By whom? He didn't say. The FBI did investigate allegations of improper connections between Kanjorski and Cornerstone, and in 2003 found no evidence of a federal crime. As for the propriety of the earmarks themselves, Kanjorski has said in the past that he consulted with congressional lawyers who told him they didn't violate any ethics rule. I'll ask a member of the Ethics Committee about that later this hour.
Finally, Kanjorski said the idea that he had done anything in office to benefit himself is, quote, ludicrous on its face. My wife Nancy and I have lived in the same modest home for more than 25 years, and anyone who visits us knows that we live by the same middle-class values we always have. And he said he was very proud of his efforts to bring high-tech, high-wage jobs to the area.
In the end, Cornerstone went under, filing for bankruptcy in September 2006. And just last March, a bankruptcy trustee ruled that Cornerstone will not have to pay a penny of the $1.34 million it owes to creditors due to a lack of assets. That comes as no surprise to Joe Udicek.
It was something that was conceived just for that family. And now it's bankrupt. The money's all gone, sucked up by the Konjorskis.
Coming up, a congressional stamp of approval for earmarks for profit. And one lawmaker speaks out against the practice and pays a big price. If you heard a lawmaker spent taxpayer money on projects he personally benefited from, you'd probably say that's wrong, if not worse. But then you're not a member of the House Ethics Committee. Here's another story that begins with an ordinary citizen who stood up to power.
This area is known as California's Inland Empire. Dotted with small cities like Riverside and San Bernardino, it's where Southern California's warehouses, citrus farms, and small support businesses are located. It is also where, 6 years ago, Art Castle retired from his job as a warehouse manager and decided to put his newfound free time to good use by researching local politics. That is what brought him to this area just off Interstate 215 in Perris, California. It's near March Air Force Base, which was hit by massive budget cuts in 1996. But Castle heard there was a move to redevelop the area using federal money. He suspected that politically well-connected people might be getting sweetheart deals.
I drew a circle around March Air Force Base that was about a mile wide. And the very second property I hit was belonging to Ken Calvert.
California Congressman, Republican Ken Calvert.
Congressman Calvert and a partner paid $550,000 in May of 2005 to purchase this 4-acre piece of property near the downsized Air Force Base. Now, for the most part, there's nothing wrong with a U.S. senator or a member of the House of Representatives continuing to engage in business transactions even while serving in Congress. But what if that congressman uses his power to benefit not only his business, but his own bank account? Well, that's precisely what Art Castle suspected that Congressman Ken Calvert was somehow doing when he bought up this land.
Nothing has ever moved in here.
Art first voiced his suspicions at a local meeting. He then called a government watchdog group in Washington, D.C., whose expertise was in researching earmarks. They were intrigued with what Castle had dug up.
Representative Calvert came into Congress as a real estate developer.
Ryan Alexander is the president of Taxpayers for Common Sense, that privately funded nonpartisan corruption watchdog group.
He came in with a background as a speculator, and once he got into Congress, he started earmarking transportation and infrastructure projects for his district.
Alexander soon discovered that Calvert had earmarked an interchange at I-15 that would connect it to I-215. It would turn the 16-mile-long road connecting the two interstates into a major highway, and that road would run right by Calvert's property.
He earmarked an $8 million road near that parcel of land.
That was in August 2005, just 3 months after Calvert purchased the land. And into that exact same 2005 transportation funding bill, Calvert added another earmark for $1.5 million of taxpayer money. It was meant to fund a redevelopment zone adjacent to the Air Force Base that would give businesses tax and other financial incentives for moving to the area. Just 6 months after the earmarks were approved, he and his partner took the property they purchased for $550,000 and sold it for $985,000, a 79% profit.
So in less than a year, he had a $450,000 profit.
We requested an interview with Representative Calvert. He declined. but sent us an editorial from Southern California's Press Enterprise, which covered the controversy sparked by his real estate deal. The newspaper relied on a local watchdog group, the Center for Governmental Studies, which concluded that his profit was a reasonable increase for that area. But we tracked down organization President Robert Stern ourselves. He told us he spent no more than 10 minutes on his analysis and seemed bewildered that anyone was using it to defend Calvert's deal.
I did find there was no conflict, but I think that he should probably be using a better assessor, a better source than I am.
Why do you think he did?
Because I'm probably the only person who said that what he did was not wrong.
Maybe on that land deal, but a much more powerful group, the U.S. Congress, would have his back the next time he requested taxpayer money that would help his California real estate interests. This train platform is set to be rebuilt into a major transportation hub linking bus and rail service throughout this region. It'll be paid for using $5.6 million of your taxpayer money that Congressman Ken Calvert earmarked for the project in 2007. Now, of course, it doesn't look like much today, but when it's completed, it will likely make this area boom. And once again, directly benefiting from a multi-million-dollar Ken Calvert earmark will be none other than Ken Calvert himself.
Calvert says local government officials asked him to earmark the transportation hub. But Ryan Alexander says the real issue is that within a 2-mile radius of that proposed hub, Calvert himself owns 7 properties. They include strip malls, restaurants, and a small office building.
There's no arguing that he had no idea that he would benefit from this.
In fact, in this case, Calvert admitted to it. Knowing that another earmark near his property would surely spark additional charges of self-dealing, he laid the issue right at the feet of his fellow members of Congress. He came here to the House Ethics Committee and asked for their ruling on the earmark that he flat out said would raise the value of his real estate holdings. The committee's decision? No problem. It was okay for Calvert to allocate government funds that benefit his property as long as other people profited as well.
I was completely floored when I heard that. I don't think the Department of Justice sees it that way.
Arizona Republican Representative Jeff Flake has been one of the leading voices against earmarks in Congress. It has been an often lonely battle.
He was beaten like a rented mule every time.
To some extent, you've made a career out of opposing abusive earmarks. Why?
Well, earmarks are really a huge problem here. They lead to overspending everywhere else, and they invite corruption as well. Members are receiving hundreds of thousands of dollars from the executives of particular companies, private companies, for their campaign accounts or their PACs. And then those companies are getting earmarks worth millions. That's why it's so corrupting. It's just wrong.
It's bribery, isn't it?
Well, in some cases, it's led to that.
The most notorious is a closed case. In November 2005, former Republican California Congressman Randall Duke Cunningham admitted to taking $2.4 million worth of bribes in exchange for government business. No one defends an outright crook like Cunningham, but what upsets Flake is that all too many people on Capitol Hill will defend congressmen who use their power to appropriate money used on projects that most Americans consider wasteful. And he is one of the few who speak out against the practice, and he's paid the price.
After the election, I was removed from the Judiciary Committee.
You were punished?
Yeah.
Who did that to you?
It was the House leadership.
Congressman Boehner?
Yes, he ultimately, he has 5 votes on the steering committee.
John Boehner is the Republican leader in the House of Representatives.
He said that the conference could not reward bad behavior.
Bad behavior? Speaking out in favor of honesty?
Yeah, apparently bad behavior is not getting suspect earmarks. It's opposing them.
We contacted Congressman Boehner, who replied via email saying that Flake's accusations are wrong and disappointing. He went on to say, quote, "Jeff and I are among the very few in Congress who refuse to request earmarks for our districts, so I'd be the last to support penalizing him for that stance." But House leadership would be given another chance with Flake, and once again, their decision would stun the Arizona congressman.
Coming up, we sit down with a congressman who many say was given the seat Jeff Flake rightfully deserved.
You've said you want to fix a broken system, but you're part of the problem.
After the break. You've heard this hour about the corrupting effects of earmarking and the willingness of Congress to look the other way as members spend your money to line their pockets. So, is there any hope for reform? Once again, here's Greg Jarrett.
The people's trust in their government is undermined by congressional earmarks.
President Bush challenged Congress on this issue in his last State of the Union address in January. But weeks later, when a GOP seat opened up on the Appropriations Committee, it did not go to Washington's most tireless anti-earmark crusader, Representative Jeff Flake. Instead, Joe Bonner, a less senior Republican from Alabama, who's been criticized for earmarking millions himself, got the spot.
Abusive earmarks have been a big issue. And in fact, many have said that may be one of the reasons why Republicans lost control of Congress. You agree?
I do. It can be an addiction and it can be a cancer that can corrupt the process. Now, that said, all earmarks are not bad.
You've given earmarks more than $1 million to clients represented by lobbyists who have in turn contributed thousands of dollars to your campaign. Do you think it's right?
And now your question makes it suggest that what I've done is inappropriate or illegal. And
I'm asking you, is it inappropriate?
It's not illegal. And I don't believe it is inappropriate.
Is it appropriate?
If you look at the balance of the contributions that I've received, and probably most members of Congress, it's come from individuals who live in our district and who support the philosophy of the member of Congress or the candidate who's running for that seat.
So what does Congressman Bonner think of the cases we uncovered?
Dennis Hastert earmarked $207 million to build a highway out to rural land that Hastert bought up, and once the president signed the bill, sold the property, making millions of dollars in profits. Is that wrong?
Speaker Hastert has denied that the facts that you have stated are accurate.
I looked at the records.
If that is, in fact, true, then not only was it wrong, it would be indefensible.
Paul Kanjorski, member of Congress, earmarked $10 million over 4 years to a company that's run by his family.
If a member of Congress is personally benefiting, or his or her family is personally benefiting, then that may involve the Department of Justice, in which case I can't comment on it.
Why not? You're a public official. You can comment on anything you want to.
I'm also on the House Ethics Committee, and if a matter were to come before our committee for review, then I am not allowed to discuss that.
The Ethics Committee weighed in on Congressman Ken Calvert. He set up a transportation center within 2 miles of 7 properties that he owned. Right or wrong?
Greg, I'm not going to answer questions about members of Congress and what they have allegedly done.
Come on. Isn't this abusive? Isn't this precisely what Americans hate?
I understand the way you have phrased the question. That would lead many people to say absolutely. I'm not familiar with the circumstances, but let me just tell you, the 435 members of Congress, 420 of them, probably even more, are not doing this for personal enrichment.
Bonner says he's called for more transparency in earmarks and has personally cut his request in half this year. His party has proposed a 1-year moratorium on all earmarks.
Unfortunately, Speaker Pelosi and her leadership team would not meet us halfway on that.
And it is true that Democrats, who are in control of both houses of Congress, have been criticized for not doing enough about earmarks. We asked House Speaker Nancy Pelosi for an interview for this story. She declined. But regular Americans we talk to doubt Congress will reform. like Marvel Davis, the woman still fighting to save her farm from Denny Hastert's $207 million Prairie Parkway.
As long as our congressmen can make money off of projects that they have promoted, what's going to stop them as long as there's money to be made?
The controversy over earmarks will only grow because it crystallizes not just the question of where our tax dollars go, but whether we can trust our elected leaders to do the right thing. And the shouting is likely to get louder as Election Day nears, as it should. Someone has to decide how your tax dollars are spent, and ultimately those public officials answer to you. For more information, log on to foxnews.com. And while you're online, send me an email and tell me what you think. The address is fncspecials@foxnews.com. And thank you for watching.